Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Tree School Online. My name is Ryan Gordon. I'm the Family Forest Land Coordinator with the Oregon Department of Forestry, and I'll be your host today. Tree School Online is a production of the OSU Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Program and the Partnership for Forestry Education. We want to give special recognition to the Oregon Forest Resources Institute for leading this project, and to the Oregon Department of Forestry and U.S. Forest Service for grant funds that have helped make the webinar series possible. As a reminder, Tree School Online webinars are scheduled every Tuesday from now until July 28th. There are 2 webinars each Tuesday, one at 10 and the other at 3. This morning's webinar will be given by Sarah Navarro, who is the Regional Sudden Oak Death Pathologist with the U.S. Forest Service. And her presentation will focus on managing root and butt rot in conifers. Before I further introduce Sarah, I want to take a few minutes to cover a few housekeeping details. As you can see, we're using Zoom this morning, and the toolbar for Zoom should be located at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see it, you can scroll your mouse over that area and it should pop up. Or if you're using another device like an iPad or a mobile phone, the toolbar may be at the top of the display. Most of the features that we're going to talk about and use today are accessed through that toolbar. Audio is muted for participants, and we'll keep it that way throughout the webinar, and video is also not available for participants. We will, however, make use of the Q&A function for written questions, and all of your questions should be posted and submitted to us through that Q&A box. I'll be monitoring it throughout the webinar, and we'll take a stop midway through the presentation. I'll answer some questions. Well, I won't answer them. Sarah will answer the questions then, and then we'll answer any remaining questions at the end of the webinar. Again, this Q&A feature is the primary way that you'll be communicating with us today. So please do enter your questions as they arise. We'll kind of let them bin up there, and we'll answer them as we go. There is also a chat feature, but you should only use that if you're having some technical problems. It's going to be monitored by Mike Clowesy, who's our co-host this morning. He's going to be helping me out in the background. So again, a reminder to make sure that you use the Q&A and not the chat for your questions. Sarah has put together a number of resources for today's presentation, and those can be found on the Tree School Online Class Guide page, which you can easily reach from the knowyourforest.org website. If you go to knowyourforest.org, click on the webinar description, you'll be taken to an OSU extension website where you can access those class resources. Also, a reminder that this class does qualify for 2 AOL Pro Logger credits, and there's a link to a form to register for those credits available in the class resources folder. These webinars are being recorded, and they'll be archived as YouTube videos and accessible from the knowyourforest.org website. And finally, we are going to use some polls during the webinar today. There's going to be one up front, and then we'll have an evaluation poll towards the end to allow you to give us some feedback. Those polls should pop up automatically on your screen in a box. After you answer the questions, you can close the poll. If you don't see the polls or see that box, you might check the Zoom toolbar for a highlighted poll button. If that button is selectable and you click on it, you should be able to access the poll. All right, so I think that's all the housekeeping. I want to go ahead and get started with the webinar. And once again, I want to introduce our speaker today, who is Sarah Navarro. She's the Regional Sudden Oak Death Pathologist with the U.S. Forest Service. And if we'd given this presentation a couple of weeks ago, I would have introduced her as the statewide forest pathologist with the Oregon Department of Forestry. She just made that jump over to the Forest Service. While she was at ODF, she provided technical assistance to private and state-owned lands on disease management issues, including root and butt rot issues. Sarah has a Master of Science in Botany and Plant Pathology from Oregon State University and a Bachelor's in Biochemistry and Molecular Biology, Fungal Biology, and Ecology from the University of California, Davis. She has extensive field experience working with both state and federal land managers. So Sarah, let me get my screen right here. Thanks for joining us. If you want to go ahead and turn your camera on and give us a quick intro.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ryan. As Ryan mentioned, had I given this presentation at tree school, I would have been still with ODF. But even though my focus has now shifted to sudden oak death, I'm still always available to provide landowner assistance for all types of forest diseases, including root and butt rots that we'll be talking about today.
Great. Well, before we jump into your presentation, then I'm going to go ahead and throw up the first poll here. So I'm going to launch that. Folks should be seeing it on your screens. And this is just to give us a sense of who's joining us today. So we're asking about where folks are from, how they would classify themselves as a woodland owner or a natural resource professional, and then how much land that they own or manage. These are questions that we kind of ask everybody at the start of each of these webinars. I see those responses are coming in. So that populates, looks to me like we have a pretty normal distribution for these webinars. About 60% of you who have taken the poll so far. Now the number's going up. There's a few more reporting in. Oh, well, wait a second. There's a question in the Q&A about whether extension natural resource agent, if extension is a natural resource agency or other. I guess I would probably classify myself as a natural resource agency. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close the polling, and I will share those results out. So as more people answered, looks like we still landed around 60% of you coming from the Willamette Valley area. We actually have 2 more folks from Central or Eastern Oregon and also from Washington State, around 10%. And 4 people joining us from outside the United States. I think that is the most I've seen in the webinars I've hosted so far. About half of you identify as woodland owners, and then around, looks like about 40% of you or so identify as a natural resource professional of some kind, and about 15%, although I know that adds up to more than 100% now. I didn't quite do the math right. Check the other category, and there's a pretty even distribution in terms of acres owned or managed. Around 22% said none, 11% at 10 acres or less, and a quarter of you said 10 to 40, and then around 15% evenly split in each of 40 to 100, 100 to 1,000, and more than 1,000 acres. I'm going to go ahead and close that out, and I'm going to get out of the way, Sarah, and let you launch into your presentation.
So as we mentioned earlier, this presentation is really focused on identification of important root and butt rots in Oregon, and then also the management of them. So what you can do to manage these diseases on your ownership, on the landscape as well. And so pathologists, we really categorize root diseases as the hidden menace. And why do we call it that? Well, it's because some changes to the forest ecosystem are rapid and we see them right away, like wildfire transforms the landscape, or when bark beetles reach epidemic status. So that's where you're seeing a direct change to the status of your trees from live to dead, and it's striking, as opposed to root diseases where these changes are typically slow and happen over time. They're a progression. And so but I'm going to give you tips and identification features so that you can kind of clue yourself in to that slow decline and hopefully in time to manage this disease before it causes a lot of damage to your stands. And so another photo example of where we have root disease is we see a combination of trees that have been long dead, trees that are in a slow decline, as you see in the center of this photo, and then surrounded by healthy trees. So really cluing yourself into those slow changes on the landscape is really important for the identification of root diseases. So what is a root disease? They are caused by fungi that live underground for the most part. I am going to talk about one that's a little bit different than the others, but is important, especially in the Willamette Valley recently. We've seen an uptick. But they typically attack and kill tree roots. And what this does is it's really limiting water and nutrient uptake. So think about they're starving the tree of water, they're starving the tree of nutrients that they need to grow and survive on the landscape. And so some of them cause decay in the roots and the butts of the trees. And so these weakened trees, and they typically result in windthrow and breakage in the stand. And so I'll show a photo example of what this looks like so you can clue in. They also predispose trees to bark beetle attacks. So on the west side here in Oregon, Douglas fir bark beetle really goes hand in hand with our laminated root rot centers, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about that. But that's another thing to clue you in is if you have an uptick in bark beetle activity, you know, there may be something going on underground that's stressing the tree out. And so whenever our entomologist, Christine Buell, gets a call about bark beetles on the west side, she usually calls me in on it as well, because it's typically root disease first and then bark beetle second. Even though I try to blame the bark beetle sometimes, she reminds me that they are the secondary cause, and really it's the root disease causing the most damage on the site. And then lastly, and what's really important, I hope it's the #1 takeaway from today, is that root diseases are diseases of the site. They've always been there, and they're always going to be there in the future. And this can make them a challenge to manage, but not impossible. And so these fungi are often the oldest organisms in the forest. We actually have one of them here out in Eastern Oregon in the Malheur National Forest. It's known as the largest living organism on the earth, which is pretty cool if you think about it, but also it does cause large landscape level damage out there. And so it's something that we have to think about. So the primary spread for root diseases is from dead material. All conifers are susceptible to this type of infection when they're young, typically up to 20 years old, and then they can grow out of their susceptibility. Even after a fire or a harvest, these fungi can live in the dead roots and live in stumps until a new generation of trees is available. So this fungi can stay viable in stumps for up to 40 to 50 years. And so this is, again, why we really call it a disease of the site. And then the secondary spread of root diseases is from tree to tree contact underground. So when trees are large enough, their roots tend to touch. And so the fungus is able to travel in that underground network of tree roots, going from, you know, the root disease center that we see in the very center of the photo, the infected stump, and then slowly going out to trees that will then die, as we see to the right side of the photo, and then goes to infect susceptible trees. And so, you know, we can use this root-to-root contact in terms of management as well, because and I'll discuss later, is that tree to the right that has infected roots, but still has kind of a live canopy. That's what's known as a bridge tree. And so you can stop the spread by removing those bridge trees and utilizing gaps in the forest for that, to try to break that root-to-root spread. So characteristics of stands with root disease. Typically we see trees in various states of decline. So as just that cartoon showed in the last slide, you have your root disease center with dead stumps, and then just adjacent to that are trees that have been dead for a little bit longer, so they have less fine branches. And then usually outside of that, we'll see trees that are recently dead, so either they still have their fine branches, They have red foliage or red needles, and then right outside of that, we may see trees that are exhibiting crown symptoms, which I'll go into next. You'll see dead and dying trees in groups, or they're scattered. So in some of these cases for root disease, especially laminated root disease on the west side, we have pretty distinct root disease pockets. So if you're looking at an aerial photo on the landscape, you can actually see the change in forest structure, and it almost looks like ringworm on the landscape. So you can just see these huge circles of no trees of one species out there. Or they could be scattered. In a lot of the east side situations, we see more scattered mortality versus distinct pockets. We also have tipped out or wind-thrown trees. Sometimes, in some of these cases, all ages of trees are affected, not just seedlings or saplings. And then again, in a lot of these cases, we have tree species that are more susceptible than others. And so we'll see the susceptible tree species like Douglas fir affected, and then tolerant species like western red cedar or pine less affected. We'll also see lots of brush. So if we're having these wind-thrown trees dying, the understory is really going to take advantage of that new light resource. And so we'll see lots of brush on the landscape as opposed to trees. And then lastly, again, root disease trees are often attacked secondarily by bark beetles. And so what do we mean by various stages of decline? So we'll see in the photo on the left, you have a live tree right next to a pretty recently dead tree. And then the photo on the right really shows that characteristic root disease center with the longer dead trees surrounded by trees that have recently died as well. So tip outs or wind-thrown trees, they just, especially the photo on the right, you see that there are no more structural roots attached to that tree. So those roots have been decayed. They're no longer providing water or nutrients to those trees. And then in the photo to the left, you'll see it does have some structural roots, but those structural roots look really stringy and they don't look like they would be able to hold up a tree that big. And then again, brush field. So this is a really good photo of some, I think, ocean spray that has come up into this root disease center. You see the older stumps, the older dead trees in there. And then again, bark beetles in root disease trees. I've seen this a lot up on Mary's Peak. There's a couple root disease centers up there that we can always characteristically find Douglas fir bark beetle associated with them. So that's kind of what the stand will look like after being affected by root disease for many years, but individual tree symptoms to look out for are going to be crown thinning, shortened branch and leader growth, and yellow foliage. So these should clue you in so these are all above ground symptoms that should actually clue you in that there's something going on below ground. And that's what we teach other other foresters when we're out in the woods with them. Look for above ground symptoms first before you go digging underground at the roots to see what's going on. And so another symptom that you'll see is stress cone crop production. So this is a really good example of a recently dead tree next to a tree that is being stressed from root disease. So it has yellow foliage, thinner foliage, and also a stress cone crop, and then adjacent to a tree that is also on its way out. Another above ground symptom that we'll see is excessive pitching at the base of the trees, known as basal resinosis. There's also staining of the bark that can happen as well. So that's another symptom to clue you in that there may be something going on underground. So the important root and bud diseases of conifers in Oregon that we're going to talk about today are laminated root disease, Armillaria root disease, Heterobasidion root disease, Schweinisii root and butt rot, and then lastly, black stain root disease. So laminated root rot, I would say that this is the #1 call that I usually got from landowners, especially on the west side. We see large laminated root rot areas up in the Forest Grove, Hag Lake area, also down in Veneta, Mary's Peak. All of those have some pretty large laminated root rot areas. So the major hosts for this root rot are Douglas fir, grand fir, and mountain hemlock. So with Douglas fir being the major host for this root disease, it really is the #1 root disease managed for in Western Oregon. Minor hosts are Western hemlock, Sitka spruce, and subalpine fir. Tolerant or resistant species to this disease include Western hemlock and Western white pine, as well as Willamette Valley ponderosa pine. So laminated root rot can affect trees of all sizes, ages, and vigor. So it doesn't matter how well your trees are growing on the site, laminated root rot will come in and infect them. Failure of green trees is common with this disease because it can travel up to 1 foot a year along the roots of infected trees. And so the roots can be completely colonized down below, and then you get a wind throw event where you just saw in the previous photo the tree with no roots. That's really common with the tree still having a full canopy. And then lastly, studies have shown that an estimated 8.6% of Douglas fir forests are occupied by laminated root rot centers in Western Oregon with about 50% mortality. So some characteristics, some signs of this disease. So we think of, in pathology terms, we think of signs and symptoms. So signs of a disease are the actual fungal fruiting bodies, so how you can identify, and then symptoms are the effects that it has on the trees. So signs and symptoms are important in disease management. So signs of laminated root disease include cream and golden colored fungus on the outside of the roots. So the cream can be known as ectotrophic mycelium, and we'll see these on the outside of roots, as you can see in the photo on the right, and then also, in the photo on the right. And when we're excavating roots to try to diagnose this disease, I usually have a Pulaski out with me, and I typically will try to slowly and carefully drag the top layer of soil away from the roots. And when you hit this white fungus on the outside of the root, it actually sounds like a crinkling potato chips. I thought one of the older pathologists was pulling my leg when he told me this, but when we were out in the field for the first time together, I was convinced it does actually make that sound. And so that forms a crust on the outside of the root, and typically then when you go to chop into that root, the entire root is rotted out because that cream-colored fungus is indicative of an infection that's been long occurring. Another way to identify laminated root rot is staining on the cut stump, known as incipient decay. So you can see on the photo on the left the red rings of stain that are present on the stump of this tree. Sometimes the staining can actually go up pretty far into the bowl. And so we look for these crescent-shaped dark rings that are really showing that the decay process is beginning. So incipient decay is what that is known as. And sometimes the stain can stay for up to 2 weeks. It's not a permanent stain on the stumps, but in direct sunlight, it can only last for a few days. And so one way for disease management for laminated root disease is really trying to identify the extent of your root rot pocket, and the staining in the stumps is really helpful for this. And so what people will do is they'll actually mark stumps that are infected. So they'll put a crosshatch on the top of the stump with a chainsaw during harvest, so that when the tree planters are going out, they know to not plant susceptible tree species near that stump. But if you are going to go with that root, we really recommend that you're getting out there as soon as possible to mark those stumps, because we've found recently on some sites, especially ones in direct sunlight, that stain's only lasting a few days and then it's no longer helpful. Another characteristic of this root rot is laminated and pitted decay. So if you look closely on this photo, you'll see pits in the woods. These pits occur on both sides of the wood, which is important for laminated root rot diagnosis. And then if you look really closely in those pits, what you'll see is red-brown hairs, and these are known as fetal hyphae. And so this is what you can see within those pits using a hand lens, which we recommend for diagnosis of laminated root disease. And so these are melanized hyphae. So think of them as larger roots of the fungus. So hyphae are essentially the way that fungi grow out, and they can be considered like roots of a plant. And so these fetal hyphae are red-brown in color. They're thicker than normal, and they're highly indicative of laminated root rot. No other root rot causes or can grow fetal hyphae. So our next important root disease is Armillaria root disease, and the major hosts really vary by site. Pretty much all tree species in Oregon are susceptible to a point of Armillaria for Armillaria root disease. Larch is a little bit less, is one tree that's known as less susceptible, but really most young conifers, especially young Douglas fir on the west side, are susceptible to Armillaria root disease. On some vigorous sites, trees grow out of their susceptibility in between age 20 and 35. This is a root disease that's widely distributed, and so it's something that, you know, if you're maintaining vigor of your stand, you shouldn't have too much damage from Armillaria root disease. So it's often found affecting trees weakened by other agents in that case. So insect defoliators, overstocking, drought, those are types of agents that can really weaken your tree and then make them susceptible to Armillaria root disease. And then disease potential really increases after harvest because you're having disturbances of the site. And so some signs and symptoms for Armillaria root disease. Symptoms for this disease include basal resinosis, so that excessive pitching at the base of the tree. So if you go in and then you cut away the bark behind that excessive pitching, what you'll see is a mycelial fan right underneath that pitchy bark. And so that mycelial fan is it's pretty thick underneath that bark, and so it actually feels like latex paint when you're pulling it back. And you can see on both of these photos, the fans can be pretty big. So this ponderosa pine on the right side, the fan actually ended up being about 3 feet wide by 4 feet tall when we ended up hacking it to see the extent of the fan. Other fungi that are out there, like the kind of the saprophytic or the decay fungi that come in after a tree has died, can also form fans, but they, I guess that picture went away, but they are easily rubbed off. So you can easily rub it off with your thumb or a finger, then it's probably not a real fan of Armillaria, and it's something that just came in after the fact to start decaying the wood. So Armillaria decay is known as a stringy decay, and so this will compromise the root structure and the integrity, so you can get windthrow with Armillaria root rot as well. Another sign of this disease are mushrooms. So Armillaria root disease produces mushrooms, and they're known commonly as honey mushrooms. They are edible. I haven't had them yet, but I hear they're pretty tasty. We typically see these in the fall, and you won't always see Armillaria mushrooms associated with the decay or the root symptoms out there. So I would say definitely look for mycelial fans to diagnose Armillaria root disease versus trying to find the mushrooms. So the next root disease is Heterobasidion root disease. We have 2 important species of this, one on the east side, one on the west side. And so we have ones that are fir type hosts, so grand fir, white fir, Pacific silver fir, and Douglas fir. It also can cause a butt rot in western and mountain hemlock. And so we have the fir type, which is one species, and then the pine type, which is mostly affecting ponderosa pine. And it really increases the potential for stand damage with commercial thinning and partial cutting really increases the potential for stand stand damage because this fungus, unlike the other ones where root to root spread is the main, almost 100% way that these root diseases are spreading in the stand, Heterobasidion in these conchs that you can see, these fungal fruiting bodies in this photo, so they produce spores, and freshly cut stumps can be infected by the spores released from these conchs, and so it can infect fresh stumps or wounds, and that could really exacerbate the problem in your stand, especially following a PCT or other entries into the stand that's causing wounding. So again, the most diagnostic is the presence of conchs in stumps. So they can be in stumps, in rotted over logs. If you ever see a pathologist out in the woods and they have their hand all the way up and into a stump and they're kind of grubbing around, they're looking for these conchs. So we try to look for these to diagnose Heterobasidion root disease in a stand. And sometimes they can be sneaky. Like you just see the brown conch and you'll just barely see a little bit of that white. And so you really have to clue your eye in to try to find them out there. We also can see button conchs sometimes on the outsides of roots. And then just like laminated root disease, Heterobasidion root disease will cause a stain in the stump and red on the wood, and it causes a purplish stain versus that reddish brown. Another good thing to clue yourself in on for Heterobasidion root disease is the type of decay that it causes. So it's also pitted decay like laminated root disease, but the pits are only on one side of the wood. It also causes irregular white pockets. So you can see this wood versus the laminated root disease, this wood has more of a white spongy appearance, and actually sometimes if it's pretty water soaked, you can actually grab it and wring it out like a sponge. And another thing to really look out for is the black flecks. And so you can see there's some black flecking in the wood right here. If it's really fresh, it looks like grains of wild rice, and that should clue you in right away to Heterobasidion root disease. And so again, advanced decay looks like just a sponge of wood at the end. Schweinitziae root and butt rot is one where the major hosts are Douglas fir, and it really, I don't know why my photos got all messed up. We'll try to fix that. It can affect other conifers, but really Douglas fir is our main host, and it mainly causes windthrow and causes single tree damage. So this isn't the same as laminated root rot, Armillaria, and Heterobasidion. It's not a whole stand killer. It really is an individual tree killer, typically in a stand, and it produces conchs on the ground at the base of the tree. And a lot of times we'll see trees that have kind of snapped at the base, like the photo on the top right is really indicative of Schweinitziae. And then these conchs, you'll see, so the blacker conch on the ground there is an older one, and then the fresher one is that lighter tawny brown right there. And so Schweinitziae root and butt rot produces, these are actual technically annual conchs, so they'll come back and grow fresh every year, versus the other fungi like Heterobasidion that causes the perennial conch. So the conchs will just keep growing and become bigger year after year. These are actually annual, and so they will start to decay. And so fresh, really fresh conchs look like the photo on the left, the velvet top fungus. So it's a reddish brown on top with a yellow margin. And then older conchs, which is how one of the common names for this root and butt rot is actually the cow pie fungus. And so it does look like an older cow pie once it starts to rot out there. And so the decay for Schweinitziae root and butt rot is a brown cubicle rot. And so you can see that on the photo on the right. So it's the wood is browner in color because the cellulose has been degraded before the lignin. And then the rot, it makes the wood kind of decay in a crumble cube-like fashion. Another way to distinguish Schweinitziae root and butt rot is you usually will get a swelling at the base of the tree. And so that's where it gets its butt rot distinction. And so it's rotting right at the root collar, right at the butt of the tree. And so lastly, the last disease, just to kind of introduce, and then we will be taking some questions, is black stained root disease. And so unlike the other root diseases that I just described, this one actually is a vascular wilt. So the infection starts in the roots and really causes a lot of, it causes damage to the vascular system. So the fungus actually comes in, infects the roots, and then plugs up the vascular system so the tree can't transport water. And so it doesn't rot the roots of the trees like the other diseases that I just described, but it really is an important root disease. And we have been seeing an uptick in black stained root disease occurrence in Northwest Oregon near Forest Grove, Hag Lake, as well as down in the Roseburg area. So both myself and some other pathologists, as well as Oregon State University, have been looking into this recently. And so hosts for black stained root disease include Douglas fir in Western Oregon and ponderosa pine in Eastern Oregon. And it really, like, one way to distinguish this is the red and dead trees along roadsides. So this fungus can spread in root-to-root contact, but it's also spread by insects. The insects can be root-feeding weevils, root-feeding bark beetles, as well as one flying bark beetle as well. And so they can, there can be long-distance dispersal of this root disease via those insects, but a lot of times the most damage we see from black stained root disease is along the edges of stands. So where root compaction is happening from road work, from brushing, and then we also see damage along skid roads. So when you're doing ground-based logging activities during a thinning, any of those trees that could be, their root systems could be damaged, make them more susceptible to those insects coming in, and then more susceptible for the potential introduction of black stained root disease. And so one way to distinguish this disease is, again, resin flow at the base of the tree, just like with Armillaria root disease. But unlike Armillaria root disease, when you take the bark off behind that sap flow, what you'll see is actually black and brown streaks in the sapwood versus a mycelial fan. So those black-brown streaks are what clues us into a diagnosis of black stained root disease. And this is what it could look like in a young sapling. So you can see that almost this entire vascular system is being clogged by this fungus. So as I mentioned, it's most severe on disturbed sites and following pre-commercial thinning. But trees do develop resistance after age 25. So we really see this as a disease of younger trees. In the recent uptick of the disease calls that we've been getting, we've been seeing it in really young trees, so in 2 to 6 years old. But then before that, we typically thought of this as a disease of 10 to 15-year-old trees. So really it can span from a couple years after planting up until the tree is age 25. And so with that, I'll take any questions.
Great. There are a lot of really charismatic terms I'm finding in this field, Sarah. It's been amusing.
Oh yeah.
So we do have a number of good questions here, and I'm going to kind of sort through them. The first one is, why does a tree produce stress cones as part of its response to an attack?
Yeah, so it's a tree's response of, I'm being attacked. This may be my last shot at life, and so I'm going to reproduce to try to get my genetics out there. And so get more trees coming in right after that tree is one of the dynamics behind the stress cone crop. So it's using its last available resources in order to reproduce.
And another one about conchs and if those can be aged at all.
On some of them, yes. If you actually take a cross-section of them, their pore layers kind of grow right on top of each other, so you can age the conch that way. It's not sometimes it's not the easiest depending on how old the conch is and if the conch is actually being decayed by other fungi.
Interesting. So multiple attackers there, huh? Fungus on fungus. Yeah.
Yes.
So some of the other questions here are related to management strategies. I know you're going to go into that later in the presentation, but I'll put some out there maybe as kind of a teaser for what's to come. So first one is if we see conchs, is it a good idea to cut the tree down before it falls, say, because of wind throw or some other factor?
For Heterobasidion, that is the one that can spread from spores coming out of the conchs. That is one management recommendation, is cutting out that tree. But for some of the other ones, and when you do see a conch, it means that, or when you do see a conch, it could mean that you could take it out before wind throw. And then there's also, and we're not going to get into this today, but on some of the resources that I provided on the course website, you'll see some heart rot fungi that do affect our trees out here. And those produce pretty distinct conchs. And so there are some management recommendations for those. So other conchs that you may see out there.
And there's kind of a related question about whether or not it makes sense to grind stumps after harvest, if that helps limit the spread of any of the pathogens you've been talking about.
For laminated root rot, stump removal is one of the options for management, and I will go into more detail on that on my slides.
Okay. Let's see here. So there's a question about minimizing the effects of harvest on various root diseases, and is that something maybe we'll save that for later? I'm thinking you might get there.
I think I do have some of that in my slides, and if we don't, then we'll go back to it. And Glenn should know.
Well, I think he might be asking the question just to make sure we get the info out there.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe leave that one up so that we make sure that we do cover it just in case.
Okay, great. We'll circle back. So a few others have populated here. Is there a best time of year when you could be out looking for some of the signs and symptoms of the various pathogens you've discussed?
Yeah, I mean, you can typically find these all year round using the kind of the different signs and symptoms that are out there. So for laminated root disease, I would say you can see it year round. You can find that ectotrophic mycelium, the acetyl hyphae on the infected roots. For black stain root disease, sometimes if you have a new infected tree from the previous year, they'll turn bright red in the spring. So the spring is, when we are doing our field surveys, we sometimes focus on spring surveys just to see those bright red and dead trees to clue us in to go search for that black staining on the sapwood. And then, as I mentioned, for Armillaria root disease, in the fall, you can see the mushrooms, but those mycelial fans are going to be there year round as well. So in general, you should be able to see them year round. And also just remember that, this presentation gives you a first glimpse of what's out there in terms of signs and symptoms, but that forest health professionals in the state are there to help you and diagnose on site with you. So definitely this presentation, I want to give you the information to start thinking about if maybe you have a root disease on your site, but then also letting everyone know that, we're here to help.
That really gets to another question that's up there about maybe reaching out to the local extension forester or your stewardship forester to answer this question about getting advice around replanting after an operation and potential impacts.
Definitely. It depends on the root rot that are in their fir trees. And then some of the resources that I posted online do have replanting suggestions, especially for laminated root disease. We highly recommend replanting with tolerant or resistant species like Western red cedar, Western white pine, or ponderosa, or Willamette Valley ponderosa pine, or red alder as well. It's another resistant species.
And this, we sort of answered this a little bit earlier. There's a question about if you can have multiple, I'm using the word pathogens. Is that a good term? You can have multiple pathogens at once?
Yeah, you can. And when we were typically not within the same tree, but we have, in doing those black staining root rot stand examinations, we have in just one stand of trees, we have found Armillaria, laminated root rot, and black stain all affecting the same stand. So they can co-occur within the same stand.
But not typically multiple in a single tree.
No, not typically.
Okay. And then a couple more. Approximately what height on a tree might you find basal resinosis?
So the basal resinosis is really, it's going to start right at the base of the tree, so right where the tree comes up out of the soil, and then it could go anywhere. I've seen it up to 4 to 5 feet up, and that was a really big mycelial fan back there, but typically you'll see it about 2 feet up the bole of a tree.
And then looks like one last one here, since you were talking red alder, are there any common root rots that impact hardwoods?
We do have some that affect hardwoods. Armillaria affects hardwoods. It's a different species on hardwoods than conifers, but Armillaria root disease can affect hardwoods. And then in Oregon white oaks, we have Inonotus. It causes a root and butt rot there. But those typically, we haven't seen them causing these same, stand level root rot pockets out there like we do in our conifers.
Great. Well, I think that gets to the questions we got so far. Again, folks, feel free to post your questions as they come up, and I'm going to let Sarah get back to the presentation.
Yeah, so we'll finish up our slides talking about some roles of root diseases. I mean, even though they do affect stand dynamics, they do play other ecological roles out there, and then we'll get into some of the management, general management guidelines for root diseases as well. So as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, most they're native organisms and they're diseases of the site. And so historical impacts, they really can cause ecosystem changes. So they act as agents of thinning in a stand, like natural thinning agents. So in a historical context, they can reduce competition with trees, shift species composition towards early or late cereal species, so moving a stand into more of an old growth system, and then play an important role in decomposition and nutrient cycling, are all things that the ecological effects of root diseases. And so why are they a problem now? Why do we, especially on the west side of Oregon, have to think about root disease management pretty highly? Part of it is altered disturbance regimes, so active fire suppression, selective harvest of high value species is a major reason. So with a lot of our management today, we're managing for Douglas fir, which happens to be highly susceptible to a lot of root diseases out there. So it's something to take into account for stand management. Again, and then intensive management. So multiple entries into a stand, pre-commercial thinning can really exacerbate many root diseases like heterobrastidion with the cut stumps, or black stain root disease with root compaction, and then recurrent use of susceptible species. So cutting Douglas fir out of a laminated root rot pocket, but then replanting back with Douglas fir is really, it's going to increase the amount of fungus that's on the landscape, and then you will continue to have that problem. And it really is our most damaging group of disease in the Pacific Northwest. And so if we think about the root disease impacts, looking at different studies that have been done, so it really reduces the overall productivity due to growth loss and mortality in all ages of trees. And most damage tends to occur on our most productive sites. So here's a couple numbers to really show the damage out there that have been done. A lot of these studies have been done in the 60s and in the 80s, and with some new research that's coming out now. But a lot of the information that we know about root diseases, we've known for a long time. And so we continue to recommend the same management techniques that were recommended in the 80s. I think one of the resources I put out on there is a pretty old resource, but it's my go-to. It's what I recommend people look at. So range-wide or region-wide estimates are typically difficult to come by in terms of Pacific Northwest-wide, but these are the estimates that were generated from a 67 report. So just to reiterate, the impacts of root diseases, they really do predispose trees to bark beetle attacks. They can change succession pathways of a forest. They can also act as centers of biodiversity because you're taking out just one susceptible host, but then leaving multiple other species that are resistant out there. And then in severely affected areas, you could have conversion of forested sites to long-term shrub fields with no intervention or management. And so when we think about impacts to watershed, it really could have serious impacts on hydrology, stream shading, and temperatures if you're going to be losing that canopy component of your stand. Impacts on carbon sequestration with trees dying within your stand. And then lastly, a threat to personal safety as well, because you do have trees that are susceptible to windthrow. In a lot of our recreation sites and a lot of our campgrounds, historically, so we have some historic campgrounds that were actually established in root rot centers, because if you're going out onto a site and you see these natural openings, and a lot of times they were great tent sites. They already had a space for a tent pad. There weren't trees to cut down. And so some of our campgrounds are established within historic root rot centers. I will say that the other pathologists in the region spend a lot of time on hazard tree training to our recreation staff, both on the state level, so state parks, as well as ODF recreation sites. And then U.S. Forest Service campgrounds are they're looked at on a yearly basis for these personal safety threats, what we call hazard trees. And so root disease management, it's a disease of the site, so you're going to have to manage it now, and you're going to have to manage it in the future. And it's really the first step of management is monitor and identify. So identify what root disease you have on the site is the number one step for management. And then the decisions based on the site-specific info, your decisions are going to be, what is the tree species composition, which diseases are present, what's the severity of the disease, and what's the disease distribution, because this is going to dictate what management options are available to you. So opportunities for root disease detection through the life of the stand. So if you're thinking about your timeline in terms of stand management and where you are, looking at a pre-harvest final exam, so looking at aerial imagery or a ground survey to investigate the large gaps with mortality and windthrow. So this is something to do even before you start seeing any damage in your stand to your new planting. Next is a post-harvest survey. So as I mentioned, with the cut stumps and the staining, so looking for your feller or regeneration forester to do visual examinations of those cut stumps and look for the staining or look for your decay as well. And then when you're doing early regeneration survival exams or stocking surveys after planting, so looking for early seedling mortality associated with those infected stumps, because as we mentioned, that root-to-root contact from infected stumps to live trees is the way that these root diseases are able to survive and perpetuate on the landscape. And then a free-to-grow exam, usually stand gaps in mortality can be seen during that time. And then lastly, your PCT and commercial thinning exams. So using those stand exams to determine the economics in investing in silviculture management or starting over with the stands. So aerial imagery and aerial detection surveys, ODF works in conjunction with the U.S. Forest Service to conduct annual aerial surveys of our forested landscape. It is complicated this year with COVID-19 restrictions, so we are working on alternatives to that. And typically, those are reported within our Oregon Forest Health Highlights. And our Oregon Forest Health Highlights also have a link to look at the aerial imagery and aerial detection of what damage agents may be detected in your area as well. And so you can look at that on an annual basis. So stand level assessments, so looking at your risk. So what is the probability of root disease being there and the expected damage? And it's really based on knowledge specific to the stand, so current incidence and severity of root disease. And to get that, so current incidence and severity, we highly recommend line or belt transect surveys, stump surveys, so looking at those cut stumps, looking for decay in them is really a good way to look at what could be going on in your stand. So root disease, as we mentioned, leaves many visible clues. So looking for those root wads, looking for the windthrow, and then also looking at disease tolerant seedlings. So you can see, in this case, this Western hemlock is doing pretty well compared to the Douglas fir that just got toppled over. So the goal is to learn how to interpret these into useful information for sound management decisions. And so I mentioned the line transect survey, and this is a common approach to sampling. So laying out a transect grid, you can walk and record map symptoms of root disease. So pros to this are visible indicators of disease are mapped along each transect. They're GPS coordinated, and area estimates are made within the width of the transect. Cons to this is it can be time consuming for a team of observers, and it can be expensive if you do have to contract it out. But this is the method that our state forests use pre-harvest. And so especially within our Forest Grove unit for ODF, there are many, many root rot pockets out there. And so they rely on these transect surveys pre-harvest to know where their root rot pockets are so they can plan to plant resistant tree species out there. Ground-based survey methods become more difficult as the stands develop and visibility along those transects decreases, and roadside surveys may miss significant amounts of disease, especially within laminated root rot pockets out there. So you really want to try, at least for laminated root disease, try to get in pre-harvest to see what's going on in the stands so you can plan for resistant tree species. At harvest ground-based surveys, so some root diseases can be detected, as I mentioned, Heterobrasidion with the purple staining and then laminated root rot with the red-brown staining. You do have to make sure you get in pretty fast. And this is, the bottom photo is an example of those hatch marks with the chainsaw. And so you have the fellers marking the infected stumps so that the tree planters can then come in and switch to tolerant species when entering root rot centers so that you can set your stand up to do better in the long term. So post-harvest surveys can be highly accurate when symptoms are abundant. So when you are looking at decay in the stumps, so looking for hollow stumps and root wads, sometimes you can also find pitted or the laminated decay in these stumps, as well as that cream-colored fungus on the outside. So really looking at the older stumps in this post-harvest ground survey for mapping of your root rot centers. Some things to keep in mind in terms of timing. Mortality levels in young stands are a poor indicator of the total site infection. just because that root-to-root contact really hasn't been established yet between all of the individual trees as well as the young trees and the stumps. Mortality is a poor measure of total stand infection at that point. It will progress to be worse over time potentially. Stand age and stocking density of susceptible species is a critical factor. High levels of tolerant species can mask the amount of root disease that's actually out there. And then by age 60 to 80, most of the root disease infected area will be apparent with symptomatic trees, mortality, and windthrow. So when we have those characteristic root disease centers are going to be most apparent in age 60 to 80. And the critical time to know the level of root disease is when you have the opportunity to do something about it. So definitely, I mean, we strive at ODF for pre-harvest surveys so that we can do something about it before we put in the next generation of trees. And so surveys determine the extent, distribution, and species of root disease, but you have to think about, are your overall management objectives being negatively affected? Because these are natural components of forests. They create wildlife habitat with the creation of stumps and down logs, and they are centers of biodiversity in an otherwise homogeneous forest. So if your management objectives are being negatively affected, then management may be necessary. If you're willing to live with a certain amount of root disease, then you may not have to manage. It really is site and land manager specific. So there's no single strategy to eradicate root disease. There's no fungicide to use for these. It's multiple components of management strategies. So looking at stand and site conditions, your long-term objectives for the stand, the costs and benefits of management, and then impacts on other ecosystem services, like I just mentioned. So the best control method that we recommend is managing for tolerant, resistant, or immune species on disease sites. And this is done by determining the root disease present and the species affected, and then managing either managing the tolerant species or starting over with tolerant species. So in young stands, thinning early, some management recommendations for young stands. Where centers are not numerous, thinning can be done, but more resistant conifers or hardwoods, like in the case of laminated root disease with red alder, should be favored in the vicinity of infection centers. Areas with scattered dead and dying individuals can be interplanted with tolerant or immune species. And where disease centers are numerous and distributed evenly among the stand, do not plan for stand improvement work. In those cases, clear-cutting well-defined infection centers and replanting to hardwoods or resistant conifers may be advisable. If root disease centers are numerous and widespread in sapling stands, consider completely starting over with your stand and replanting with a more tolerant species. So commercial thinning, it does not reduce the amount of inoculum out there, but if root disease is limited, then thin healthy portions of the stand and avoid root disease centers, avoid that disturbance. Also patch cut when thinning and replant with tolerant species, like we just mentioned on the last slide, and avoid in stands excessive or extensive diffuse root disease centers unless tolerant species can be left behind. Just kind of want to leave those areas alone. And then plan for an early regeneration harvest in those cases, in some cases as well, if you don't think that your stand is going to reach the age and the stocking level that you have set. So regeneration harvest, shorten rotations to limit that loss is important there, and then regenerate to a mix of disease tolerant species. What you choose will depend on your site. You know, we're not going to recommend Western red cedar on a really dry site, and avoid microsiding seedlings with infected stumps. So avoid planting seedlings right next to that infected stump. Sometimes stumps can provide really good sites for seedlings, but in the cases where you have infected stumps, really avoid those areas. And if you do want to replant with Douglas fir, we recommend to keeping Douglas and Grand fir to less than 30% of the stems that you replant. Inoculum removal, so this kind of gets to the stump grinding question. So stump pulling or push falling of stumps has been done in the past. It's currently not in use, to my knowledge, in anywhere in Oregon or Washington. British Columbia does do stump pulling, but it is subsidized by their government. And so they do have landowners on what's called crown-owned land, so it's leased land, that they are doing stump pulling on, but it is subsidized. And so it's pretty expensive. It can only be done on gentle slopes with light soils. It does eliminate most inoculum, but not all. The disease will slowly start up again because you'll never be able to get 100% of that root ball out of the soil. There'll still be some fine roots in there that will still hold on to some of that fungus, but you will greatly reduce the amount of fungus that is in your stand. And then be careful with stands with discrete root rot centers. So this is an example of a stump removal operation that's been done in the past. Another thing that we recommend, other than just planting with tolerant or immune species, is buffer cutting or bridge tree removal. As I mentioned in one of those first slides, in between the disease tree and the live tree in a root rot center, you have what's called a bridge tree. And so if you remove that bridge, you can then slow the growth of the fungus. And so buffer cutting is removing a strip of trees between an expanding root rot center and adjacent unforested regions. And so because the fungus requires live roots to spread, and so cutting trees to create a buffer zone of dead roots around an infection center can protect the remaining stand from becoming infected. So here's some other management considerations that have been put forth in the past. These are all things, I'm just going to put them out there as these are options, but they are typically not the options that we recommend to people. Really, the biggest options are bridge tree, patch cutting, and then regeneration with tolerant resistant species. Those are really going to be your two important management recommendations. All of these can reduce the spread, can limit the impacts of laminated or of root disease, but they're either they're costly or they are just not available as options to everyone. And so the bottom line, the takeaway that I want you guys to have from the management side of this presentation are root diseases are here to stay. They're diseases of the site. They're always going to be with us. And historic roles of root diseases have changed with alterations in disturbance regimes and species compositions. So we do have them in more sites and more areas. They are drivers of forest succession, composition, and function, to think of them in a slightly positive light. Tree species vary in susceptibility. Root disease incidence and severity vary by site to site. The key is to recognize their presence and that management options do exist, and assistance is available, as Ryan was mentioning, from our OSU Extension Service, Extension Foresters, from the Oregon Department of Forestry. Your stewardship foresters are a great resource. Many of them have received forest health training, and if they get in a bind or they're stumped, pun not intended there, then they will call the forest health experts, so the ODF pathologist or entomologist, for help in identification. And then lastly, the U.S. Forest Service Forest Health Protection also has resources and staff available to help as well. And with that, I'll take more questions.
That was a great pun, even if it wasn't intended.
Oops.
So we do have a number of good questions in the queue here. I wanted to throw one out that I scribbled down for myself. I noted that a lot of your management strategies are really focused on switching to tolerant tree species, recognizing the real challenge of eradicating, if you will, the pathogen or stopping it. I'm just curious, thinking about forestry as a long-term game, a long-term game, and we think about length of rotations. So if you were to do that, you come into a site and put a lot of tolerant species in, how long do the pathogens stay in the soil? On the next rotation, say in 60 years or 80 years, could you switch back and potentially avoid infection? Or
you could. So we've seen, I think the studies have shown between 40 and 50 years is when they're viable in the stumps. And so you could come back later on and come back with a rotation of Douglas fir. But again, you're most likely never going to get 100% sterilization of a site.
Right. Always some background level in the soil.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, all right, coming back around to the Q&A, questions we got binned up here. Maybe it'd be good to start out with Glenn's question and see how we did there in terms of harvest disturbance. I think he did ask a question kind of specific to that, and I wonder if you had a little bit more you wanted to add around how that might contribute to spreading of these pathogens.
Yeah, I think that definitely harvest disturbance does increase the problems with root disease. As I mentioned in the management slides, we do have more incidents of root disease out there because of the harvesting that we have been doing. Some things to minimize, I think minimize after harvest is really planting with tolerant species. And then if you're thinking about minimizing during the pre-commercial thin and commercial thinning, avoiding those root disease centers is one way to minimize.
Let's see, looking at the questions here. I'm just trying to pull out some of the more management related questions. So there's one here about whether any studies have focused on alteration of soil pH following harvest, if that's a potential method for decreasing fungus.
That's a really good question. And off the top of my head, I do not know if there have been any studies on soil pH alteration.
And then maybe somewhat related, potentially a good research question for somebody.
Yeah.
There's potentially a related question here about boraxing stumps. Is that a common treatment? And if so, what root disease would it be focused on?
It is a common treatment, so that's a good question. It's a common treatment for heterobacidity on root disease. And so after harvest, if you do want to replant with susceptible fir species, it is recommended that you use borax on top of the stumps. There's a product that I believe is registered here in Oregon called Sporax. And so it is a stump application on there because, as I mentioned, the conchs form on older stumps. And so you really want to, essentially what the borax does is it makes it so that the spores can't colonize those cut stumps. So great question.
Another question here, maybe about more of a biological control. So you'd mentioned again that this idea of fungus attacking other fungus. And the question is if there are species of fungus or other biotic or abiotic factors that help to keep certain species of pathogens in check.
Ooh, that's a good question. In terms of root diseases, I'm not sure. I do know that there are heart rot fungi that will compete within the wood and they will compartmentalize other fungi, creating just mycelial barriers so that they can't colonize the wood. And then we do have other plant diseases in some cases that Like with phytophthora, water molds, you have some phytophthora that are more aggressive than others, and so they can keep those species in check.
Let's see. So a question, I think, getting at the sort of the economic or structural value of infected trees after harvest. How do these pathogens tend to impact the structural integrity of those trees?
Mm-hmm. It really depends on the advancement of the disease in the stand. So in some instances with laminated root rot, we're just seeing that staining, that the beginnings of decay in the stump and along the base of the tree. So there's no structural integrity loss in that case. But if you get in a more advanced stage of laminated root rot, that decay of the roots where it's pitted and laminated can extend up into the butt of the tree. So you can buck logs shorter in order to still get them onto the truck and the mill will accept them. But for laminated root rot, it depends on, and for many of them, it really depends on the stage of decay at the base of that tree and how far it extends up. But it's not typically the trees are going to completely collapse and fall over before it extends too far up into the log. So you can usually at least get one log length out of them. For the Schweinetzii root and butt rot, that's really going to cause an extensive decay of pretty far up the bowl. So you could lose more structural integrity of the trees with that one.
Let's see. So it looks like Jennifer, who's our wildlife biologist at ODF, posted a comment here about some of your slides on the importance of diversity for wildlife habitat. And she just was sharing that she found that root rot pockets are sometimes the most diverse areas in stands, and they're great for songbird habitat. I didn't know if you wanted to add anything there.
Yeah, I should have had more slides on that. Sorry, Jennifer.
And then let's see, do you have a favorite resource that you use out in the field for helping to identify pathogens? I'm sure one of those is probably noted in the resources section for this class.
Yes, I did note the new OXU extension guide for insect and disease in Oregon. So that's on there. And then there's one other one that actually I forgot about adding, but it's a common insects and disease guide for Oregon and Washington produced by the U.S. Forest Service. So I'll make sure to get that up on the class resources as well. That's a good one for just general identification. It doesn't have any management recommendations, but for identification, it's really handy. And it's available online.
Great.
So I'll get
and
that
I see there that we've got a comment there that we'll take that down and make sure that we put you in touch with this individual who wants to follow up with a few more specific questions.
Yeah, I saw the Indian Henry campground, that is an example of a campground established in a pocket, in a root rot pocket.
A couple more, I've got a couple more scribbled down. There's one more up here, but before we do that, I do want to go ahead and launch the wrap-up poll here. So I've started that, and folks can go ahead and get in there and give us some feedback on today's webinar. And Sarah, if you wouldn't mind clicking to the next slide, I just wanted to mention to everybody this afternoon's Tree School online webinar starts at 3 o'clock, and Christine Buell is going to be back this afternoon. She was with us last week, and she's going to be talking about bees this afternoon. So if you're interested in that and you're able to join, we'll start that at 3. And if you're not already registered, you can sign up at knowyourforest.org. And while folks are filling out that poll, there was another question in here about tolerant species. And I know that was kind of a, you kind of have talked about that as you've moved through the presentation. Maybe you could just give us a quick recap on what you mean by that and some common examples.
Yeah, so tolerant species are going to be tree species that are able to tolerate having the root disease on the site. The root those root rots aren't going to decay the roots or even colonize them in some cases. And so which species are tolerant to which diseases they can be kind of specific. And so the course resources that are on the OSU website do include a list of tolerant species for each specific root disease that I talked about. But definitely some ones that come to mind are going to be Western red cedar and red alder for laminated root disease. Those are two really, really important ones that we recommend.
And I'm curious too, I'd scribbled again another note to myself. So we've kind of talked about these pathogens in a sort of a negative light, although as you pointed out in your presentation and Jennifer was highlighting, they have a lot of benefits as well, depending on your management objectives. And I'm just curious if there are other fungi out there that we think of in a more positive light. If you could take a minute or so and touch on those. Or do they all cause death and destruction?
Well, I mean, that's what a pathogen is. A pathogen is causing an unwanted situation within a host, usually what plants you're managing for. But as we heard with Jennifer, they can cause other ecosystem services. So songbird habitats are important. Openings for wildlife to come in and forage. If root rot pocket does turn into a brush field, then that's great forage material for elk and deer. And so thinking about the broader scope of pathogens. But there are also fungi out there in our forests that are decayers and decomposers, and they're cycling nutrients for the plants, for trees and plants to uptake. So they're a part of our ecosystem, and we're never going to rid them out of there 100%. But how do we live with them and manage them in some cases?
Yeah. And so there's one more question that just popped up here. How do you avoid the root rot trees in the middle of a stand that's being commercially thinned?
Yeah, so that was on one of my slides that I mentioned. And so that's where surveys are really important. So going in and delimiting the root rot pocket that's out there and marking the trees so that fellers can avoid that area when they're out there doing a commercial thin, and thinking about also having a buffer of trees as well.
All right, well, I'm not seeing any more questions coming in the box here, and I think I have exhausted the ones I scribbled down during the presentation. Is there anything else you wanted to share with us today?
I think that's all. Thanks,
all right.
Ryan.
Great. Well, thank you. I appreciate your time and presentation, and appreciate everybody who was able to join this morning. And I hope that we'll see you all this afternoon at 3.